Do you remember the first time that you read one of the Scary Stories books?
Well, I would have been a kid, so and my memory's not fantastic, but I'm of a certain age that I was definitely reading these the same time a lot of other people were. The third book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the third book of the series came out in 1991. I would have been 11 years old, so I probably, was reading those right when they came out, and then, I read R.L. Stine, a lot of Goosebumps and Fear Street, and then by middle school I moved on to Stephen King. But, I definitely remember these books very fondly. I actually, if I reminding myself probably in my 20s, I'm about to be 39 now, but I definitely remember these in my 20s, kind of fondly remembering, oh yeah, those illustrations were great. And probably the thing I remember the most, though, was the source material on the back of the books, because that's just kind of how my head is wound. I find it interesting. Okay, these are really cool stories. They're all, come from folklore. And then in the back, they gave, Alvin Schwartz, the author, went into great detail about, all kinds of variations and where the stories came from. And I just found that really interesting.
And when was it about the time where you decided that you wanted to make a documentary based on the books?
Well, it was about 5 years ago. It's been a long journey. Based on my background and interest, I kind of had in mind doing a full-length documentary on generally literacy and books and children's books and kind of the importance of getting kids reading at a certain age. Of course, you want that to hinge on something, right? You want a story. And when I thought about these books, and I knew there was a fan base there, you could tell, you could see it on social media. You could just see, wow, a lot of people very fondly remember these books. On top of that, there was a certain mystique about them because, unlike, I interviewed R.L. Stine and a number of other children's book authors for this. He's been interviewed a million times,
Yeah.
Which is great, but at the same time, there was a certain mystique with these books because the author passed away shortly after the third book, and the illustrator kind of famously does not, or it's come to me to be, I've gotten to know very well the fact that he doesn't do interviews, and so there was a certain, information, hole or mystique around these books that people talked about them a lot, but no one knew too much about them. On top of that, it's arguably the most challenged children's book or book in general of the last 40 years. It was number one most challenged book of the 1990s and remained in the top 10 between 2000 and 2009. So you juxtapose those things together, you have something that's wildly popular and it was heavily challenged. Right there, I knew there was a story there. It's like I there's a lot to figure out, but I definitely knew, hey, that's a topic that I could spend a ton of time going in different directions and makes for an interesting story.
Apart from trying to find out more information about Stephen Gammell, because he's famously closed, what were some of the other challenges you faced getting this off the ground?
Well, I mean, with a documentary this expansive, right? I mean, you have 82 stories and a few like songs and that sort of thing. It can go all over the place. Okay, hey, I'm not going to be able to cover all 82 stories, and I can't go to every location or go figure out every source, of every story and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of just kind of, and that's to some degree, you get somewhat of a wide net. And then in the editing, you figure out, okay, I mean, I want this to be a manageable, okay. I want this to be interesting for even people that aren't familiar with the stories. It's a fun hour and 25 minute something, but also very interesting. And we get into the censorship piece and so on and so forth. So it's kind of, taking something that really, to be honest, you could spend a lot more time with. And on the DVD, there's an extra 20 minutes, and I have some ideas of using various other footage just to kind of put it out there to say, hey, this was an interesting avenue. It didn't quite make the cut, but maybe it's a 5-minute long, something on YouTube or whatever. I'm still kind of figuring that out, but yeah, I mean, definitely from an editing standpoint, kind of working out the expectations between hardcore fans who maybe would want you to spend a long amount of time on certain things, and then just kind of realistically saying, okay, what can I fit here, in a time frame that makes sense to me. And and then when you start talking about a lot of different stories, like I said, a lot of different locations, okay, but my budget is not unlimited. I can't go everywhere. So let's, so trying to figure out, on a limited budget, what can we do, in a few trips, a few things. And I went all over the U.S. I went to both coasts, as well as made a trip in the Midwest here. And so definitely kind of jumped around. Same thing with the censorship piece. I mean, you could go, there's a whole different documentary that it should exist in some ways, there's bits and pieces of it in other documentaries where you could spend, a good amount of time really delving into that. I that was only about, a third to some degree of what this particular documentary is, because there were the other things to cover, but you could spend a lot more time talking to librarians and people who are on the other side of the argument and so on and so forth. Me, I tried to package it into a particular story that, made sense for me,
When it comes to the people that you interviewed about the censorship piece, whether it be the academics that were pro having this book in schools and the PTA members that were staunchly against children seeing this, how receptive were they to being interviewed on camera about this interesting time in the late 80s and early 90s?
Surprisingly, it went okay. I mean, I'm relatively proud of how things worked out, but it is a tricky thing to navigate. There's no doubt about that. Now, admittedly, the people that are kind of questioning whether these books should be in schools or elementary schools, so on and so forth. I mean, there's different categories of them, as well as on the other side, I'm sure you could come up with different categories of how staunchly they believe in, banning, anti-censorship, so on and so forth. But, in this case, I mean, there's definitely cases where, okay, I don't think these books are necessarily, a gift from the devil and, they're demonic and so on. I mean, there's people that go that far. There's plenty of other parents and PTA mothers and so on and so forth where it's more a matter of they don't belong in elementary schools at all, right? And then you could, go down further. I mean, and debate whether all kinds of things. It gets into a lot of interesting arguments, and definitely what I found helpful was to say, okay, in plenty of cases they're talking about age appropriateness, and okay, I have an 8-year-old, and I admit I wouldn't have him read this because I know he can't handle it, and he can't. He tried a few minutes of the Goosebumps movie, and he said, "Nope, I'm out." And so, and that's fine. He's only 8 years old, and he knows what he can handle and can't handle, and that sort of thing. So, I think there is a conversation to be had, and that's honestly kind of was my purpose. Was not to necessarily settle the issue, because that's not realistic, but to kind of get the issue and the conversation going with more people. So using a popular title like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark gets a lot of people in the door, checking out the story behind these books, and then you open up a can of worms. Okay, did you know about this? Did you know about that? So on and so forth. And that's, in some ways, that's what Alvin Schwartz did with these books, right? He people kind of put him alongside authors like R.L. Stine. Well, this is a title that's a little different because they're all taken from folklore and urban legends, and there's a lot of interesting, themes and things you under the surface that can be talked about, and that's what he did with the source material. So, in some ways, that's what I felt like I was doing with this documentary. Okay, I'm going to give you what you want. We're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about a big nostalgia title that a lot of you remember, and I hope you'll appreciate that and have fun with that. But then I'm going to give you something else maybe you didn't know about.
Mm-hmm. Something I noticed, I was thinking back, you and I are about the same age. There was a time between 1990 to 1993. Some of R.L. Stine's early books were very graphic before his Goosebumps series began. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the battle that Alvin Schwartz had to face with the schools kind of forged R.L. Stine to take more of a friendlier approach or towards parents with his Goosebumps series, or do you think these are just kind of disconnected things?
It's hard to look at any one decision and say, okay, it is a reflection of this other thing that was going on. Mm-hmm. I tend to think over time, to some degree, I think him and his publishers probably were figuring out along the way, and that's how they came up with multiple different book series that cater to slightly different ages, right? He has mm-hmm. Fire Street. Okay, Fear Street. Now I can maybe be a little edgier there, but in Goosebumps is more for the younger crowd, and so on and so forth. I think that's most likely. I would like to think, and in fact, in some ways, that's what Alvin Schwartz did. Many people very fondly remember one particular story and always attribute it to the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books. It's the Green Ribbon story, which mm-hmm. is by Alvin Schwartz. He did put it in a book, but it's in a different book for younger readers. In a dark room.
We got that book here.
Yes. And so right there's an example. Like he didn't. I feel like he didn't live long enough to go in that direction, but I feel like that was the seeds were already there, where all the authors were kind of talking about, okay, kids are naturally, interested in reading scary stories in different ways. But let's kind of go in a couple different directions and have some be more for slightly older kids that can handle certain things, and then one for younger kids that can handle. Okay, I want to be a little creepy, but maybe I can't quite handle it too much more than that, so on and so forth. I think they were figuring that out, and mm-hmm. I generally think, compared to the 80s, publishers probably have figured that out more, which is to say, they're not opposed to a lot of things catered to different, kids at different age groups. They're just kind of like, okay, especially now the internet, okay, parents are going to look this stuff up, so let's try to just be upfront with, okay, how graphic is this versus this, and what generally do we think this age group is for? Although, admittedly, it's a flawed system, but I can't blame them for at least attempting to be a little more upfront with it,
Oh, yeah. Did you notice when you were speaking to the adults, or people that were adults during the time of the books first being published, that they were encountering more people that were against the books without even having read them?
I think that was there, yes. I definitely, whether I heard it directly or just read people talking about them, that sort of thing, I think, I think, the general sense I got, and I know at least some people made points to say, to some degree, it was being objected against more because it was wildly popular than for, specific content, right? Mm-hmm. Plenty of people had not read it. They just knew, okay, I heard what's in there, and and this is reflective of, you know, stuff that shouldn't be in our schools, period, at all, so on and so forth. And so, you know, what we kind of get into to a certain degree is this idea that, okay, back then it kind of makes sense, you know. It was a kind of what they call satanic panic type situation where there were a lot of people in the news talking about cults and Satanists. And so, you know, is it that surprising that, you know, the most challenged book of the 1990s was something that touched on, you know, dark things, you know, stuff that most of it was, you know, has been in Grimm's fairy tales and a lot of other, you know, dark tales that we've told children for many, many years, right? So, you know, it's not something that is that new, but it makes sense that at that particular time, that was something that was being drawn to parents and people were objecting to it, right? These books are not, they haven't been, the original ones were published between 1981 and 91, so they're not, although they do re-release them, they're not quite, you know, prominent on this as much as other titles, but also more than anything else, I would argue that nowadays we have like LGBT and other titles that are being questioned and put on the challenge book list and so on and so forth, more because let's look at what's in the news nowadays and so on and so forth, and it's a little more reflective of that than, you know, what is, you know, particularly, you know, questionable now, how it's now different than 30 years ago. It's not, it shouldn't be necessarily. It's more a reflective of, you know, our culture and the news and what we're talking about nowadays.
It's an interesting parallel to look back at trying to ban a horror book series aimed at kids, and now we hear people trying to say, well, we need to also censor classic literature, you know, Huckleberry Finn and whatnot, just because there is quote-unquote objectionable material in there, even though it was appropriate for the time it was written. Censoring any books or taking them away from children, just in my mind alone, is very wrong. I have a daughter, so I don't see anything on my bookshelves that I would say, no, you are not allowed to be exposed to this material.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a point that was made, you know, and could go on and on about is, you know, this idea that, okay, some of these stories aren't nice, okay? And I'm not going to say this is a nice story where nice things happen or, you know, so on and so forth, but that, you know, is that what we limit our kids to? Only stories that have nice things that happen? You know, it's, you know, at some point they need to learn that, you know what, the world isn't always nice, right? And, these things need to be, you know, talked about at some point. Now, you know, admittedly, we're talking about parenting. I've got kids, you've got kids, so on and so forth. We all, you know, have to live in a society where we're all our individual parents. And so, you know, I think if I do want to censor my kid, I guess as a parent, I'm allowed to do that, right? You know, there's a, you know, I'm not letting my kid, you know, go out and watch a, you know, NC-17 movie, you know, there are different lines, right? And we have to live in a society where we have to be parents, you know, and be able to have a certain amount of censorship, you know, over our own kids. That said, like I said, we live in a society. We go to, you know, public schools, and so we have to make these decisions together. And, you know, a different parent doesn't get the right to censor my kid, and so it's a tricky thing, right? I like to think I painted some nuance there, even though, you know, admittedly, I think the end result is pretty positive about these books, definitely, and kind of showing that a lot of people got a lot of benefits from this book series. So we should question other titles, right? Question, okay, you know, one that's popular on the censorship piece nowadays is Captain Underpants, which is one of my kids' favorites, right? And it's silly and it's so on and so forth. And there's definitely, all kinds of things. I'm not saying we should, encourage. That said, I'm glad that my kid is taking an interest in reading, and if it means having, a character named Professor Poopy Pants, that's fine, whatever, let's get the kid reading first, so, yeah.
Let me see. I had a point, and I just lost it. It started to rain. All of a sudden, I was like, "Oh crap! Did I roll up my windows?" Something I noticed when you were interviewing Alvin Schwartz's son is there seemed. This is not a fault of you as a filmmaker, but I noticed that he seemed very detached. Like there was just. It seemed like we could have gotten more information, but he just wasn't willing to divulge it. I don't know if that was a case because of their strained relationship or something else, but I feel like I didn't learn as much about Alvin Schwartz as I should have. And I just don't know if he wanted to divulge that information or he was very reserved or what.
I mean, I think it's a tricky thing, I can't imagine being in his situation, talking about a parent who passed away quite a long time ago and had a fractious relationship with, but also was being very honest about it. I mean, so it's a tricky thing, and at the same time, as much information as we got, at the same time, there's a certain amount that I feel like is also a little bit lost to time, I was told about, video that in theory exists, but I never got it. I couldn't find it. I imagine it doesn't exist anymore. A lot of the stuff we're talking about at least 20, 30 years later. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I felt like at the end of the day, he was very forthcoming, and there's definitely things that exist that probably is things that end up being in some of the DVD extras and things like that, because I spent hours with him, so there's a lot of details there that, yes, admittedly, from an editing standpoint, didn't quite get there because I was working for a certain flow, and I wanted to keep a certain amount of interest. Like I was saying earlier, it's like you're trying to balance, how much to cater to people who would like this to be a 3-hour documentary, and others who want to keep engaged and want to know the story, but an hour and 25 minutes is about enough for them, sort of thing. I don't know.
I agree. It was a very well done documentary. You did do a very good job. And one of the biggest things is the books are no longer about the author or the artist. They're about what it is to the community. It belongs to all of us now. And you did a great job of showing how it influences art and influences culture, and how even the stories themselves, even though they're more or less geared toward kids with a little bit of an edgy side, some of them are morality tales, important morality tales. And that's something that I've very rarely seen discussed when discussing the Scary Stories book. Very rarely do you ever hear anyone say that this tale is a morality tale for for adolescents in love and engaging in some semi-adult things, like the story of the hook, stuff like that. And so it was great to see that kind of topic brought up in your documentary. Because, like I said, it's rarely talked about when you're discussing these books. So it's always about the art or always about the gory stories, but never about the subtext.
Sure. And that, there's just generation after generation we could go into, okay, what are the cautionary tales of different time frames? The ones like The Hook and the babysitter, the call coming from upstairs, the calls coming from upstairs story. That stuff totally bore out of the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, that time frame where, young adults are being left at home by themselves, new technology like phones are being left there, and here's the cautionary tale: when you're being left at home and you're just a teenager, here are the things to keep it. Okay, it's the 60s now, and teenagers are actually getting the ability to drive out by themselves. Here's a cautionary tale: if you go parking, on Lover's Lane, here's what might happen to you. I mean, so you've got, that time frame, but then you go back even further, then you're talking about Hansel and Gretel type stuff, right? Okay, some old lady giving you candy, here's what could happen. You might end up in an oven, right?
Yep.
The story that's in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is the drum, which is somewhat similar, right? Two little kids go to the village. There's a girl who says, here I've got this neat little drum, this little thing that they think is really neat, and they really want to see it. And she says, well, you have to go home and be bad. And it kind of progresses. You're not bad enough. You need to go home and be really bad, and so on and so forth. And eventually they go home and they find that their mother has turned into some creature. That's very Hansel and Gretel, very Germanesque, where it's like, okay, be careful, you children going out there, be careful of the people you come across, be careful of strangers. Now, what I get into a little bit in the documentary is, okay, whether it's Hansel, Gretel, or the drum, or some of these other stories, oftentimes it has to do with be fearful of people that are different from you, right? Be fearful of other types of people that eat weird things or do strange. In the case of the drum, it's a gypsy. It's described as a gypsy. Why would it have been a gypsy, right? I mean, again, that's some of the stuff that I found the most interesting and most fun to go down. Now, again, there's like 82 stories. I tried to package it a little bit to something that was a little more digestible, but that was kind of one of the fun things for me, honestly, because my degrees are all in English literature, and I just find it fun kind of delving into the stories we tell and some of the underlying meanings,
One of the stories that I've always wondered the origins of, and I don't think it's in the back of the book, it's a Mitai Dodie Walker. Did you, upon making this film, did you happen to discover the origins or the meaning behind that particular story?
Yeah, but it wasn't. I mean, there was a little bit of a dead end. It wasn't quite as full as some of the other ones. I definitely found a previous, and I'm not going to come up with it off the top of my head, but I did at some point find like, okay, here's a previous version of it, but I didn't go as far enough to go, even further. And but that is one that, oh gosh, let me see. That is definitely. Oh, did it make? No, it's DVD. It's DVD. But I remember that was one. That's the tricky thing with a book series that has 82 stories. So, what I found a lot of is people saying, "Oh, well, you must. I assume you're going to talk about this story, or I assume you're going to talk about that story." And admittedly, it was about a dozen there that I heard over and over again, right? And so definitely, I started to form like okay. I've got to have a greatest hits. I've got to touch on certain ones, but it's more than people think. Everyone assumes, oh no, it's only this story and this story that anyone ever remembers. But guess what? It was always different stories that people mentioned. I say it wasn't 100% different stories, but there were at least a dozen. I would say more than close to 20. That's like okay. These are very memorable ones. And so on and so forth. So it was a tricky thing. What I did in some cases was collapse some into, okay, here's a theme that I found, and here's a little interesting direction we can go for a little while, But yeah, it's definitely, and Mitai Dodie Walker is definitely one of the ones where it's like that's a phrase that I hear people kind of jokingly say. Same way with Slithery D.
Yes.
The Slithery D, which is that's a more fun one. There's a lot of them, and so, it's, if someone wants to, talk me into doing a sequel, then maybe we can cover more stories,
Especially the ones that have historical context, like the Wolf Girl and some of the other ones that are like that you can trace down an actual person that's associated with the story, are some of the more interesting ones. Do you find that the ones that people remember more have to do more with Gammell's artwork or with the stories themselves?
I think it's a mix. I really do. I mean, there's, I'm one of those. What I'll say is, I think I have come to the belief that they should not be separated anymore. They just have become so tied together. It's like saying, okay, let's take some other famous example. Let's take out this character and divide it into two different stories. This book has these things, and this book has these other things. Which is going to be more popular or more memorable? It's really, it's really hard to tell. I mean, I think Harold is one that comes up a lot, right? And the illustration, of course, is fantastic. But what a point I've made before is that Harold wouldn't exist as a story, as a pop culture, entity, if it wasn't for Alvin Schwartz. I looked up. I went to the library where he found the story, and it's in just a big, huge collection of random stories. And I guarantee you, if it wasn't for him plucking that up and doing a certain rewrite of it, because it wasn't exactly the same, definitely. If it wasn't for him, no one will have heard of Harold, and he wouldn't be like a boogeyman in the same way that a lot of people our age. And now I feel like with the adaptation, it's going to be even more so. A lot of people, Harold is the next Freddy Krueger or whatever. I mean, he wouldn't. There would be no Harold if that hadn't have been plucked out of obscurity and put in those books. So
the same with the pale woman that we saw so much in Del Toro's adaptation.
That's a somewhat random story, very well done, very creepy, but I don't know if it's not like The Hook that, The Hook would be, I mean, that has been done previous, and that's a big urban legend, and it definitely fits in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, but that didn't particularly need Alvin Schwartz to kind of give it a life, because it already had a life, right? But there were definitely a number of those where it's like, if he hadn't kind of found a folktale somewhere and repackaged it in that way, then they wouldn't have a life.
As far as when people can see or purchase the documentary, where will people be able to go and get their hands on it?
So May 7th, it's coming to VOD. So it's going to be, if you search, it's going to be on a lot of different, common ways to get it on VOD on May 7th. And then July 16th, it'll be available on DVD. And it's playing in a few select theaters this month, basically April and into May. It's just a few cities, so you could definitely look and see if it's playing at a local theater. But mostly kind of nudging people. Starting May 7th, anyone can just get online and get it.
For the DVD, can you tell me some of the extras that are going to be available on it?
Sure. It's about 20 minutes. It's a number of like little things, like 3 to 5 minutes. Things like In a Dark, Dark Room. I just, it was kind of a tangent. It's a very important tangent for many people, because many people remember that book for younger kids. So there was something like that I was able to package and say, okay, let's get into that, because Barbara Schwartz, wife of the author Alvin Schwartz, that she's got her favorite story in that one, and she talked a little bit about that. And and then there were a few things where it's a story that didn't quite make the cut, but it was a nice little something. Same thing with some censorship pieces that just, like I said, didn't quite make the cut, but at the same time, I found it really interesting. And, but like I said, it's over 20 minutes.
Okay. All right, Cody. Well,
sorry. And I was just going to say, and I forgot, I do have a full narration of it. So if anyone is intrigued by all kinds of scenery that we did and things like that, I kind of go into all kinds of tangents with the narration of it.